Chapter 10 of D99 by H B Fyfe. This LibriVox recording is in public domain. First sensation that penetrated, agonizingly, to Taranto's consciousness was that of heat. Heat, and then the damp itch of soaking sweat. The next feeling, as he groggily sought to take up the slack in his hanging jaw, was thirst. It was a raging demand that brought him entirely awake. Before he could control himself, he had emitted a groan. Immediately he was dropped from whatever had been supporting him in a swaying, dipping fashion. He landed with a thud on the ground. A chatter of Sisokan broke out above him. It was answered by other Sisokan voices farther away. Taranto kept his eyes closed and lay limply where he had sprawled, while he tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Shortly before dawn, he and Myers had each swallowed his capsule as directed. He remembered a period of vague drowsiness after that, then nothing more until he had been awakened just now. From his still dizzy mind, he sought to drag the outline of events expected. They had hoped to be taken out to the desert, possibly to a Sisokan burial ground, according to the local custom, and left to be dried by the desiccating blaze of the sun. It had been planned that a spaceship would land in the late afternoon to pick them up. Undoubtedly, it would take the Sisokan several hours to report the deaths, and to secure official permission for disposal of the bodies, even though they were less given to red tape than Terrans. Still, they should have abandoned the bodies long before Taranto had expected to awake. He risked opening one eye a slit. Sisokan legs crowding around blocked his view, but he could tell that it was dusk. The heat he felt must be that of sand and rocks that had baked all day. It must have taken the Sisokans a long time to get this far. He wondered whether they had brought him an unusual distance into the desert, perhaps to avoid contaminating their own burial grounds, or whether they had simply indulged in some long-winded debate as to the proper course to pursue in regard to deceased aliens. My God, he thought, what if they decided to dissect us? I never thought of that. I wonder if the joker that sent those pills did. Whatever had gone wrong, he was well behind schedule. He could imagine the chagrin of the DIR man watching the proceedings through his little flying spy eye. Taranto hoped the spacers hired for the pickup were still standing by. At the worst, they would have water. Cautiously, he tried to move his tongue inside his mouth. It stuck against his teeth. He suspected that the taste would be terrible, if he could taste at all. The heat, he thought. I've been soaking up heat all day and not sweating. Now it's jetting out of every pore. Whatever the drug had done, or failed to do, it must have nearly suspended most of the normal functions of the body. No wonder he was perspiring so heavily as he began to recover. Even so, he felt as if he had a fever. He began to hope that he had not been carried for very long. Unless he had been lying in the cell, or better in some examination room at ground level, for most of the elapsed time, while disputes held up disposal of his body, some instinct told him he was very likely to die. Someone rubbed a hand roughly over his face, slipping through the film of sweat. At this demonstration, renewed exclamations broke out above him. One of the Sisokans shouted some gabble, as if to another some way off. A moment later, Taranto heard a hoarse yelp that could have come only from a Terran throat. Then words began to form, and he realized that it must be Myers. That blew the pipes, he thought, and opened his eyes. A Sisokan looking down at him hissed in astonishment. Others, who had been watching another group about 20 feet away, turned to stare down at Taranto. He was hauled to his feet by the first pair that thought of it. One, a minor officer by his red uniform, sputtered a question at the Terran, forgetting in his evident excitement that he was speaking Sisokan. Taranto wiped his face with his shirt sleeve. He was beginning to feel a trifle cooler as his perspiration evaporated in the dry air, but his surroundings seemed feverishly unreal. He could not quite understand what Myers was shouting now, but even in the hoarse voice could be detected a note of pleading. Taranto thought it must be something about water. The Sisokan before him gathered his wits and repeated his question in Terran. What does this mean? He demanded, glaring angrily at Taranto with his huge black eyes. The Terran tried to answer but could not get the words out. He gestured weakly at a water skin secured to the harness of one of the soldiers. After a brief moment of hesitation, the officer waved permission. The soldier detached the container and handed it suspiciously to Taranto. Fearing the effect of too much liquid in one jolt, the latter forced himself to take only a few small swallows. He wished he could afford to stick his whole head inside the skin and soak up the water like a blotter. You are dead, declared the officer impatiently. The tiny greenish-gray scales of his facial skin actually seemed ruffled. Taranto dizzily sought for some likely apology to excuse his being alive. He decided that there might be a slim chance of getting away with a whopper. If it is officially declared, then of course I am dead, he croaked. What do you expect? Look how weak I am. The Sisokans swiveled their narrow-pointed skulls about at each other. I'm in the last minutes, said Taranto sadly. "What last minutes?" asked the officer. "It's the way Terrans pass on," asserted the spacer. "Didn't you ever see a Terran die?" The officer silently avoided admitting so much, running a hand reflectively over his thick waist, but his hesitation provided an opening. "That's the way it goes," said Taranto. "First a blackout, we sleep that is, then the last minutes, the sweat of death, and bluey." He raised the water skin and sneaked a long swallow, risking it because he feared he might not be allowed another. He was right. The officer snatched away the skin and thrust it into the long fingers of its indignant owner. "If you are so dead," he demanded, not illogically, "why do you drink up our water?" "Sorry," apologized Taranto. "Where are we?" "What difference is it to you? I don't want to make hard feelings or bad luck by dying in one of your burial grounds." "It will not happen," said the officer grimly. "We have been sent in another place to guard against that. Look back, you can see the city over that way." Taranto turned. The outline of the city walls, with lights showing here and there on the watchtowers, loomed up about 5 miles away. A small rise in the rolling ground of the desert hid the base of the walls and the greater part of the rough trail that had evidently followed. It would have been a fine spot for a spaceship to drop briefly to the surface. "Do you wish to lie down here?" asked the officer politely. "We will wait until it is over." "Don't be so damn helpful," thought Taranto. He looked desperately about, striving to give the impression of seeking a comfortable spot. He felt the situation turning more and more sour by the minute. It would be very difficult to feign death successfully again now that the Sisokan suspicions were so aroused. They might well make sure of him in their own way. Near him stood a half a dozen brown-clad soldiers. 4 of them, spears slung on their shoulders by braided straps, had apparently been carrying him while 2 others acted as relief bearers. Besides the officer, there was a sub-officer, also in brown, but wearing a red harness. In the background, a similar group clustered about Myers. Taranto saw that he had been tumbled from a sort of flat stretcher of wickerwork. It was of careless craftsmanship, as if meant to be abandoned with the body it served on the last journey. He wondered if it could be assumed to be his property. "Don't put yourselves out," he said. "I can't hardly take a step even to sit down. It'll be just a couple of minutes now. Goodbye." The Sisokan officer made no move to depart. Taranto had not really dared to hope that he would. He was trying to think of some further excuse when Myers saved him the troubles. "Help! Taranto!" shrieked the other spacer, bursting suddenly from the group about him. "I told them we're alive and they want to kill us!" He ran staggeringly toward Taranto, picking up spurts of sand. His shirt front was dark with sweat and dribbled water. He looked wild with fright. "Ah, they do live!" exclaimed the officer. "Seize them!" He seemed to realize only after about 10 seconds that he had, this time, spoken Terran. Evidently feeling that not all his men might have learned that particular language, he began to repeat the order in Sisokan. Taranto interfered by swinging his fist at the center of the greenish-gray features. The Sisokan, arms flung wide, sailed backward and landed on the nape of his neck in a patch of gravel. Myers screamed hoarsely as his own bearers caught up to him and dragged him down. Taranto sprang forward to snatch up the wicker stretcher from the ground. A long-fingered hand clutched at his shoulder, but let go when he kicked backward without looking around. He raised the stretcher and swung it around in a wide arc at the 3 Sisokans reaching for him. 2, having left their heads unprotected, went down, but the stretcher frame crumpled. Taranto tripped the other Sisokan, glancing hopefully at the sky. There was no sign of the fire trail of a descending spaceship in the deepening twilight. Then he had to duck, as the other 3 bearers were upon him. "Get up, Myers!" he yelled. He met the rush with a hard left that dumped the leading Sisokan on his back. The next hesitated and was brushed aside by the 6th, who had had the wits to unsling his spear. Taranto sidestepped the crude but large point that thrust straight at his belly. The shaft of the spear slid along his left ribs, and he punched over the outstretched arms of the soldier at the Sisokan's head. He clamped the spear between his elbow and body, retaining it as his attacker staggered back. 2 or 3 were now advancing from where a knot of figures seemed to be sitting upon Myers in the gloom. They did not especially hurry. Taranto had begun to reverse the spear to jab at the Sisokan left facing him, when he heard a scrabbling behind him. He whirled away to his right, ducking instinctively as a body hurtled past him. When he faced about, he found that most of those whom he had knocked down were again on their feet and advancing. The officer, the lower part of his face smeared with purplish blood, ran at Taranto full tilt. He screamed an order in his own language. The spacer cracked the butt of the spear smartly against the Sisokan's head, sending him down on his face. One of the others, however, managed to get a grip on the weapon. Instinct told Taranto that any attempt at a tug-of-war on his part would lead to a fatal entanglement. He dodged away and sprinted toward the group pinning Myers. A Sisokan voice yelled mushily behind him as he concentrated upon driving with the greatest possible force into the writhing group before him. He struck with a crunch that tumbled bodies in all directions. Taranto himself felt sand scrape raspingly against the side of his face as he half rolled, half skidded along the ground. His pursuers now caught up to the new location of hostilities. The first thing Taranto saw as he managed to drag one knee under him was the butt end of a spear plunging in his midsection. The Sisokan behind it had his center of gravity well ahead of his turning feet, obviously intent upon doing great bodily harm. The spacer wondered for a split second why the native did not use his point. Then he twisted hips and torso to his right, drawing back his left shoulder. As the spear passed him, he slipped down hard on the shaft with his left hand. The butt dug into the sand, and the Sisokan hissed in consternation as he vaulted head over heels before he could release the weapon. The one immediately behind was caught in the center of his harness by a flying foot, whereupon he collapsed with a groan across the prone figure of his comrade. Two more who had dropped their spears reached out toward Taranto, urged on by the officer on their heels. Taranto saw Myers stagger to his feet. Then the two Sisokans were all over him. He skipped away to his left over a pair of limp legs, parried a groping hand, and brought around the long, low left hook that had made him respected in past years. In the ring, he had floored men with that punch. At the least, he expected a fine loud whoosh from the Sisokan, but the latter disappointed him. He folded in limp silence. For a second or two, everything stopped. Taranto stared down at the soldier slumped on the ground like a loose sack of potatoes. Even the Sisokans who were not at the moment engaged in pulling themselves to their feet also gaped. Light dawned for the spacer. Those among whom he had gone headhunting kept getting to their feet as fast as he knocked them down. "Hit him in the gut," he yelled to Myers. "That's where their brains are." He charged at the nearest Sisokan lips, drawn back in an unconscious snarl. The soldier made a reflexive motion to cross his arms before his thick abdomen. Taranto, unopposed, hit him alongside the head with a light right, then whipped the left hook in again as the arms began to lift. The Sisokan went out like a light. "Come on," Taranto shouted at Myers when he saw that the other had not moved. "Two of us could do it. Those heads are too little to hold a brain. Kick 'em, if you can't do anything else." "Are you crazy?" retorted Myers, his voice hoarse as much with fear as with thirst. "They'll kill us. Give up and they'll only take us back." Taranto sensed someone behind him. He started to run, but two or three recovered Sisokans headed him off. He tried to cut back to his right. He slipped in a patch of sand and saved himself from going flat only by catching his weight on both outstretched hands. One of the Sisokans landed across his back, feeling blindly for a hold. Taranto surged up, trying to butt with the back of his head. He was promptly wrapped in the long arms of another soldier facing him, as the grip from the rear slid down to his waist. The fellow behind him seemed to think he could hurt him by kneading both knobby fists into the spacer's belly, but there was too much hard muscle there. The Terran again butted forward this time, and brought up his knee. This was less effective than it should have been, but it helped him free one arm so that he could drive an elbow backward. The officer ran up with a reverse spear. From the look in his big black eyes, Taranto realized that the Sisokan had also learned something during the melee. That explained, no doubt, why he was an officer. He swung the spear in a neat arc, at Taranto's head. It cracked against the Terran's skull. Even though he did his best to ride with it, he felt his knees buckle. He struck out with his right fist, but the punch was smothered by the soldier whom he had kneed. The spear came down again. The world of Taranto's existence was reduced to a narrow view of a straining greenish-gray calf showing through a torn leg of a Sisokan uniform. Vaguely, he realized that he was on his hands and knees. A great number of hands seemed to be grabbing at him, and his own were very heavy as he groped out for the leg. He got some sort of fumbling grip and started to haul himself up. The slowness of his motions alarmed him in a foggy way. He tried to tuck his chin behind his left shoulder because he knew that there was something coming. It came. The Sisokan officer's big foot took him behind the ear with a brutal thump. Taranto, however, sinking into a gray nothingness, did not really feel it. End of chapter 10.